Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 51 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. This is the hardest talk about the hardest form of money, where we cover everything that has happened this week in Bitcoin, in macro, and geopolitics. And I think we have an ordinary level of news flow this week, but we'll see how we get on because it has been absolutely wild. If you're joining me for the first time and we have not met yet, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 2 decades of my life obsessing over the topic of Bitcoin, investing, and money. And I've documented the whole journey so everybody can come with me as we adjust to a world of Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. And so without further ado, let's jump straight in with this week in Bitcoin. Now, the main story that we're going to be covering and the reoccurring theme throughout both the Bitcoin, the macro, and the geopolitical section is that as we speak right now, we have heard that RFK has stepped down from the presidential election. It started with Arizona, and then the Trump administration or the Trump campaign announced that there will be a special guest joining him at the rally tonight. Now, if you have watched my previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk, where we did a couple of emergency broadcasts where I covered behind the scenes of all of RFK's policies, Trump's policies as they spoke at the Bitcoin 2024 conference. And them joining force is actually a really big news for America because RFK gets Bitcoin. He's a real Bitcoiner. And so the rumor is, and this is just a rumor at this stage, we will find out, even as we're recording, there may be doing, at some point, RFK may be joining the rally with Trump tonight. And we will find out exactly what's happening. But the rumor is that RFK may become the head of the CIA, which is both the good news and bad news, because we know that the deep state is Mossad and the CIA. And on top of that is the Federal Reserve that has its cronies in the bank with the Bank of England and the European Central Bank. They sit on top of the chain. Then you have the intelligence agencies, and then underneath it, they just put whichever government they would like in order to follow the Israeli first policy for United States of Israel. And we have seen that in full force. And we are also witnessing what may be at some stage the decoupling. But obviously, RFK and Trump and Harris are all part of the deep state. And so that won't change their stance, but is becoming very problematic. At the same time, there is a force for Americans to protect yourself from the occupation of the Federal Reserve and the deep state of Israel, and that is Bitcoin. And so RFK being able to build the Bitcoin strategic reserve with Trump may be just what America needs in order to create a counter resistance movement to the Federal Reserve and the fact that they built the largest debt-based Ponzi scheme that is unconstitutional and took America away from its constitution and turned a capitalist country into a socialist country that eventually wants to turn it into a central bank digital currency, which is communism on the blockchain. And so they've managed to get you $35 trillion in debt. And now approximately every 100 days, you are adding another $1 trillion. You pay that to the Federal Reserve. $10 trillion of that debt sits on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, and it pays its shareholders a 6% dividend proportional to the number of assets that it has under management. That money then goes across to its foreign parties like NATO and Ukraine and Israel, and it fuels the military-industrial complex, and the money comes right back inside to bribe politicians and lobbies. And if they don't accept those bribes and the Congress members, then they just put you on the Epstein list and connect you to pedophilia. And so that's how politics works. And this is the so-called democracy that America is looking to export through the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund is the economic hitmen that go and get the world into dollar debt so that they can control their central banks, which need to print money in order to pay that dollar debt so that they can pillage their assets, just as we are seeing right now in real time in Venezuela, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and all the other regions that have been destabilized across the Middle East in order to serve the Greater Israel Project and to surround China with the Philippines and Japan. And we have these central banks that are playing the game in between. So RFK and Trump joining forces is interesting, because here's how you know when RFK and Trump want to drain the swamp. What they will do is they will release the 9/11 files. And what was really interesting this week is there was a space with Candace Owen when various people told people to search about what really happened on 9/11. And there was a trending search on there called Dancing Israelis, and people that were looking at Larry Silverstein, who was the net beneficiary of 9/11 in that covert operation. And so now people are able to talk about these things. It is creating an interesting time. And both Trump and RFK have said that they will release those files. And because there is the files connected to JFK, maybe they could redact those names that no one wants them to see as well. And then we might be able to understand some of the actions that have happened more recently and why October the 7th was nothing like it was actually portrayed to be by the media that's part of the deep state that controls the narrative in order to make sure that you are prepped to go to war with Iran. And we will update on all of that in the geopolitical section. But Bitcoin is the resistance movement against that. And the great thing is that every individual can use it, every company can use it, and so can every country to protect themselves. And RFK had a strategy that he presented at Bitcoin 2024. Now, Trump said that he will do it. He said that he'll transfer the 200,000 Bitcoin that America currently has. If you watch previous episodes, I'll let you know why those don't necessarily belong to the US, but we will see what the Department of Justice does with those ones. But this is a really good force for America to be able to protect itself from the Federal Reserve in order to combat the deep state. We shall see, because we know that all candidates are bought by the deep state, as we have seen already. But I think that this really propels the Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset, where the government can put the 200,000 Bitcoin on its balance sheet and it can commit to the purchases that RFK said. And I think it was Cynthia Luma who put the bill out there right now, and Thomas Massie has the bill in order to end the Fed. So America, you have everything you need to free yourself from Israel, the deep state, and if you choose right now, or you could continue down this path. And I believe that with $35 trillion of debt and $217 trillion of additional liabilities, you are very unlikely to be able to do that without the Bitcoin strategic asset reserve. And El Salvador is leading the way, buying 1 Bitcoin every day to free itself from the shekels of the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of England. So let's get back into the Bitcoin section. What does this mean? Well, this is very good for Bitcoin. So today we had a couple of pieces of news. We'll cover more in the macro section. But the economic hitmen like Jerome Powell from the Federal Reserve, he came and he bowed down and he indicated to everybody that there is a change of policy. We think we have inflation under control. We've stolen enough money from the poor, given it to the rich. We're ready to pump the real estate and stock market assets again and make the gods of the markets happy again so that we can create more inflation later. And he came out and gave the indication that he's ready to pump the Ponzi scheme again and roll over the debt so that more assets end up on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Now, some of the things that people do with that money is they exit from fiat currency and they buy Bitcoin. So this is always good news for Bitcoin. But remember, the difference with Bitcoin is while it gets a pump from the Ponzi scheme of the Federal Reserve, it also is a solution to when the Federal Reserve Ponzi scheme unwinds. And so it allows people to protect themselves from by owning their own money without a bank, spending their money without government sitting in the middle, and protecting themselves from the Federal Reserve by beating inflation through its fixed money supply over the long term. So this is all bullish for Bitcoin. And I really hope that America does get to free itself from the Federal Reserve. And then maybe we can stop doing these covert operations that rely upon forever wars and destabilize the all of the other countries around the world, so you don't have to have so many enemies when we transition to this multipolar world. And there was big updates that I'll be covering in the macro and geopolitical section. So that's the Bitcoin story. This week, we also saw that on the Ethereum side, remember, Ethereum is different to Bitcoin. Bitcoin works off proof of work, which means that it doesn't matter who owns it in terms of controlling it. ETH works off proof of stake, which means whoever owns it can stake it and control the governance. And BlackRock is in the process of taking over that proof of stake network because it wants to tokenize securities. And it's almost like the new version of the Federal Reserve, where everybody sat around in Jekyll Island and figured out how to design the system to them. So Ethereum now has, within the Ethereum ETFs, $1 billion in BlackRock's control. That's significantly more than I thought it would be. That is moving pretty big in terms of net inflows. And Fidelity has now 375 million under its control, and Bitwise has 310 million. So they are building up their strategic reserves so that they can control the governance, so that when they launch this tokenized securities, and remember, BlackRock is going to be launching the Texas Stock Exchange, which is likely, as speculation, may be built upon Ethereum as tokenized. So it's building up its ability to control the network. And Grayscale is shrinking because it's charging that high fee. So remember, I always said this would cause selling pressure once the ETF is launched, and then it will probably lead to a slowdown of the selling pressure as the other ETFs come in. Well, we've now had $2.5 billion of outflows from the Ethereum ETF run by Grayscale. So it is clear right now what Bitcoin's going to be. It is freedom from the central bank. Ethereum is a new network and a new layer that's being built through the proof of stake network that will host stablecoins, central bank digital currencies. But there's also competitors to Ethereum, but the SEC is showing that it wants to continue the same stance as the Biden administration. So Solana, which is a more centralized version, where FTX was the biggest backer of it, and it just sold off a bunch of those tokens on the cheap to Pantera, which is a VC fund that will be dumping those tokens onto the market as soon as they unlock. But the SEC rejected all of the Solana ETF applications, stating that we believe Solana is a security. So it will go through this rigmarole, and we will see where the SEC draws its lines. But what makes this really clear is that we were seeing the exact same policy with the Harris administration as we would have seen with the Biden administration. So we can see that Harris's version of crypto friendliness, or a crypto reset so far, is more of the same, and putting Gary Gensler in a highest position, which is the one that said, let's allow all these ginormous scams like Celsius and FTX to prevail, and then let's blow them up, costing billions of dollars to pensioners and innocent victims. And then what we'll do is we'll take some money from SBF, some client money, and we'll donate that to the Democratic and Republican parties. And SBF can have a meeting with Gary Gensler at the SEC. And then as soon as that one blows up, we'll put some regulations in, because BlackRock and the other cronies at Fidelity, Van Eyck, and everywhere else can now take over, given that we're more comfortable, and we'll just drain through Operation Choke Point 2.0 the bank accounts of the companies that we were never regulated in the first place, because we don't care about consumer protection, but we do care about taking those big fines and getting their cut of the client money that was stolen as a result of having bad regulations. So now those that are trying to push forward the Solana ETF, they need to reply and say how Solana is not a security, even though it is a deeply centralized network that goes down, and everyone looks to the developers saying, please, please fix this, when a blockchain is not meant to work that way. It is meant to be independent of any one party. But that case will probably push forward, and we'll see whether the ETF providers want to pursue that, or whether they want to put that, or just shelf that one for now. So at the moment, Solana is being classified as a security, And if the Harris administration gets through, you can bet that it's going to be more of the same of no virtual asset service provider regime, hostile regulation through enforcement, and corruption, where you take down the players that you don't like and hand over the industry to the players that you do like. Thanks. And now you start to understand why Bitcoin is different from the rest. But the next filing would need to determine and prove that it is a security. And so that's what's we're happening there. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has said this is an important asset class and we want to support it. So Dubai has officially decided that it wants to approve Bitcoin and crypto for salary payments. So Dubai is attracting many of the Bitcoin and crypto businesses and has noticed that people want to pay in Bitcoin. People want to, rather than take their fiat currency and have to trade it to Bitcoin, they'd like to get paid directly in Bitcoin. So they've made it where you can pay that without incurring capital gains tax, which supports it in being a currency, so that you can actually use it as that mechanism as well. At the same time, Tether, full disclosure, I'm a shareholder in Bitfinex. Tether is the sister company of Bitfinex, but they have now launched their next stablecoin, which is a UAE dirham-backed stablecoin. And so that is additional diversification away from the dollar-backed. They had euros next, and then they did gold, and then they did a synthetic gold. And now they're doing the UAE dirham as well. But when we look at the institutions, now that Gary Gensler decided to give the industry, the more centralized parts of the industry over to their buddies, we've now got approximately 15 of 25 of the largest hedge funds. They all have disclosed in the last few months that they hold Bitcoin ETF holdings. So traditional finance, they originally tried to laugh us out of the room. And then they tried to take over the industry by saying not Bitcoin, it's just blockchain. And when they lost that, they ended up joining the industry, and they're all doing it through the ETFs right now. But fortunately, Bitcoin foresaw this and said, with proof of work, it doesn't matter who owns it. We can still maintain the discretion and without having what happens with proof of stake as well. Now, what else did we have? Now, BlackRock has passed Grayscale, which was the previous largest asset owner or traditional financial institution. And now BlackRock has more than $22 billion in ETFs across all the different Bitcoin ETFs and Ethereum ETFs. So that position is now the number one on the chain is BlackRock, with Grayscale in second, with a shrinking asset as it starts to redistribute, normalize, and soon we can get back to normal price action as a result of that transition that we warned people about all the time during Bitcoin Hard Talk. And so they're putting together their position, as we said, in the proof of stake network. And I think this is getting ready for the launch of the Texas Stock Exchange. And they did their beta with Securitize. Full disclosure, I'm a shareholder in Securitize. They raised finance through Bank to the Future. Bank to the Future investors all got into that deal as well. And they have launched a tokenized security that is backed by treasuries and various other things. What else did we see? Now, Italy, the second largest bank, or second oldest bank in Italy, rather, Banco Sella, and they're enabling Bitcoin trading to their over 1.3 million customers. And so this is an interesting one because in the US, they got in way of the regulations that says you can hold them off balance sheet so that you don't remember. The Ponzi scheme of banking means that banks create money every time they issue a loans. So they have regulations like Basel III that says when you increase your assets, your asset is also a liability, because when someone deposits money at your bank, you also owe it to them back. They do that double bookkeeping, which is what allows the magic of creating digital currency every time they issue a loan. They're now allowed to offer Bitcoin as custody to their customers. and it doesn't affect the Basel requirements because they're probably, and I haven't looked deeply into this, doing it as custody, which is the way it should be done, so that you can remain title of those assets and it's not commingled with the bank's asset, so that then it can do a force against fractional reserve banking for those that actually want to exit. At the same time, we saw a little slither of something from Kamala Harris in terms of respect for the Bitcoin and crypto industry, and we are still searching for something. She had her big speech, her epic speech at the DNC conference yesterday, and she revealed her economic policies, which consists of thinking that America can pay down the debt and redistribute assets through tax. So more taxation of corporations, which just means more shenanigans to redistribute it, and it never actually works. Caps on prices for shops. And by the way, the shops are not gouging people. All the data and evidence shows that they're getting shafted by the production, the means of production that's coming in. And so by putting those shops down, it means that those shops go broke, just like they did during COVID. And then everyone starts shopping on Amazon. And then the price of Amazon goes up, which increases the centralization of the top 7 tech stocks that control the vast majority of NASDAQ, and means that you just wipe out small business, and you get more and more wealth inequality. And as with all things like increasing minimum wage, it has the opposite effect, because America is a fully socialist economy controlled by the Federal Reserve. And the only player that matters right now is not the fiscal policies, because the Federal Reserve will always find a way of getting all the assets over onto its balance sheet. And the market only goes up when the Federal Reserve releases a new tool to pump the Ponzi, which drives more wealth inequality that eventually leads to civil unrest when you move to a new change in empire. And so what did come out? Let me just make sure I got the right wording from the Democratic administration. So apparently Harris supports policies to expand crypto industry. We know what that means. It means more of the same of the Biden administration, where you put together more regulations in order to transfer the innovative part of the industry and transfer it over to the traditional financial players that are all connected to the deep state, that launder all of their money through the colleges in America, which is how they get exposure to all the stocks and funnel all the money into owning Congress, which is how they get their way and make sure that these laws are written in line with this so-called version of democracy. Okay. What else have we got? So the final part on the Bitcoin news, I think we had CZ that came out of prison. So CZ was put down for 4 months because his exchange was engaging in money laundering, all sorts of shady activities. But remember, he was engaging in putting together Americans which weren't meant to be used on the platform because they didn't have the licenses, and then connecting it with people that are on the US hit list, i.e. people resisting against the oppression of the Federal Reserve. And those organizations, they were putting them together, and there was billions of dollars of transactions that was completely out of line with US laws. And so therefore you expect they charged $4.7 billion. The SEC, the DOJ, all the 3-letter agencies, they say, thank you very much. Give us the proceeds of crime. We'll put it in our bank account and you can go to prison for 4 months. And so CZ is now out. And at the same time as him coming out, there was a new class action lawsuit from opportunists in America that decided to beastify the fact that this was happening, use the legal system and say, hey, what can I extract from Binance? And so they opportunistically put a class action lawsuit saying you were making me do money laundering, and therefore you need to give us shitloads of money. And so that opportunistic lawsuit and class action lawsuit came out at the very same time. And some good news for you. There was the withdrawal of a US bill that would have essentially required very strict reporting requirements on any Bitcoin or crypto that you hold in self-custody, what they called, what the IRS called unhosted crypto wallets. And you are freed from that. You now do not need to follow that, and you got a little bit more of freedom to own your own money and host that money in self-custody. And so there is a little tick box for the Biden administration in terms of, are they going to protect? Remember, the difference between the Trump and assuming RFK joins as well, is that they can only say what they're going to do. With Biden and Harris, they can do what they say. And so when I see this, credit where it's due, but the rest of it is just like looking like more of the same, which is taking away freedoms and property rights from Americans and using three-letter agencies in order to, rather than putting together productive regulations, use the industry in order to support the cronies that control the lobbies and the banking lobbies that put those rules in place. Right. So if you enjoyed the Bitcoin section, that's everything I've got for you today. RFK and Trump working on a Bitcoin strategic reserve is great, but I would like them to also drain the swamp, release the 9/11 reports without the redactions of all the names of the Israeli people that were on there that they took off, and also release the JFK files so that everyone can see how false flag operations work to create the fake war on terror, so that everybody can understand why they don't really need to go to war with Iran and why they should register AIPAC as a foreign agent, just as JFK tried to do when he tried to cartel the illegal nukes that Israel had, and then he was no more after that. Show America the truth and also free Ross while you're there at the same time. Do what you said you're going to do. This is all good stuff. Right. So if you're enjoying this, please do me a favor. YouTube hates all the content that I create. I've got some freedom of speech on X at the moment, but I rely upon you. They give us no traffic. They don't like the words that we say. This is not exactly the message that they want out there. But I care about nothing other than the truth, and I will keep telling you the truth as I see it and tell you where I'm wrong as well. But push the pressure in order to free everyone from central banks and allow people a peaceful transition through Bitcoin, whether it's you as an individual, whether it's your company or your country. I will keep doing that. So do me a favor. I'm going to take a quick water break. I'm going to do the macro section and the geopolitical section. And I would just like you to hit the like button, put a little comment. Let me know what you think. I read all comments. I'll reply and share this. Do me that favor. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Okay, let's move over to the macro section. So what happened this week? Well, we turned out that there was a complete misrepresentation of the unemployment numbers in the US. So all of a sudden they said, hey, you know those really good unemployment numbers that we used in order to turn around that Black Monday as a result of the Bank of Japan Ponzi scheme, giving everyone free money to buy stocks on the Federal Reserve from the Federal Reserve pump. And as we put down rates, we'll come up and buy all those stocks, put them on the Federal Reserve balance sheet so that the shareholders of the Federal Reserve can pay themselves a higher dividend. Well, it turns out that they misreported 818,000 fewer jobs. They then announced that, and then we have the announcements from Jerome Powell that controls the Federal Reserve, or at least is the chairman on top of that. For the deep state and the occupation of America. And he says, whoops, okay, we can have a shift in policy right now. And so there was a complete misreporting of that in order to fudge the numbers, make it look better, recover the market so that we can then start looking at the rate cuts, which is what everyone's begging, because it benefits the real estate prices and the stock markets at the expense of the average American that's struggling to pay their rent because they don't own those assets. And so what I think somebody should do is they should do what they did with the crypto industry. They should investigate that for misrepresentation and misleading investors. And the SEC should do their job, but they won't, because if you investigated that, you will find out that that is a normal thing that any public company would have a big fine from the SEC for. So let's hold everyone to the same account. But of course, the Federal Reserve will ensure that that never happens at all. And so Jerome Powell, he came out today and he said that it is time to change the policy, or sorry, it's time for the policy to adjust. That is code word for we think inflation is now under control, even though it's still above about 2.7%, which is, by the way, manipulated through illegal immigration in order to fudge the numbers and make it look better. But you as real Americans, you know what it is. And everybody else knows that inflation is still high because we are all just derivatives of the Federal Reserve with worse monetary policies because everyone's in, or the countries that are in debt slavery to the IMF, have to factor out sending all those dollars around the world as well. But the Federal Reserve is expected to cut rates for the rest of the year. The market is saying that it's probably going to be 0.75% to give some relief to Americans that are stuck in debt slavery. And so hopefully that will be relief for some people. But at the same time, it will just lead to a heightened inflation because the problem is definitely not solved. And that is at the same time as the Bank of Japan having to increase, which makes the unwind of the Japan carry trade worse and worse and worse, while we still have that $600 billion of unrealized losses on the bank's balance sheets in America after the last bailout scheme from the Fed and FDIC in the 2023 bank run crisis that was created by Peter Thiel coming on X Spaces, telling all his buddies, withdrawing billions of dollars from Silicon Valley Bank, telling all his buddies that they should do the same. And then Bill Ackman coming up on X Spaces saying, I will buy all those banks at Silicon Valley as long as the government and the taxpayer underwrites the entire banking system, and then we'll come along and buy them for pennies on the dollar in a distress sale. We basically caused a bank run through X Spaces. Thank you, Peter Thiel. Thank you, Bill Ackman. But now there's $600 billion of unrealized losses that came through the Federal Reserve hiking rates very quickly and causing the issue that led to that distress situation with the banks. So next week, we have the inflation numbers, and those inflation numbers, if they are in line with expectations, then you will most likely in September get a reduction in rate, which is why there is a bit of a recovery in the financial markets. That's a result of Powell's speech, because everything depends upon the occupation of the Federal Reserve. It is the entire economy. What else have we got? Now, the important part here is how it is actually framed in September. Because if it is framed as inflation is under control, pat ourselves on the back, we get to cut rates, then, it's all factored into the price right now. But if it is any type of event that happens between now and then, and it is framed as some kind of cut as a result of a recession, then we could expect some changes in the market. But remember, stocks are almost at all-time high again. Isn't that miraculous? The Federal Reserve, through these fudging of numbers and being able to reduce rates, no longer sees the Bank of Japan as an issue. It managed to unwind all those trades with zero damage, and the stock market is pumping as usual. So almost all of the Black Monday correction, where normal markets is correction is good so that real estate becomes cheaper, you have a deflationary cycle due to the excesses of the Federal Reserve. Instead, we pump up again and we just move over all again until we get excessive debt to GDP ratios and complete more and more wealth inequality. But as a result of that, gold also hit new all-time highs. It's now past the $2,500 mark. So there is buying pressure from central banks and people looking to protect themselves as well. And so central banks, remember, we've got the BRICS currency, which is going to be announced in October at the BRICS summit as well. And they've given the indication it's going to be a cryptocurrency and it's going to be tied to real resources like oil and gold, using the blockchain in order to make that peg. and eventually probably they'll get to a Bitcoin play because Russia just legalized Bitcoin mining and put together their legislation around that. And I expect to see similar things coming from China and Iran as well, in terms of making it a industry in their countries. And maybe that will become it will eventually, is my prediction, become part of those strategic reserves, so that countries can free themselves from the central bank and not be in the position where your reserves can be deleted by America, like what happened to Russia. And now they will build a network where they can trade with each other without SWIFT censoring transactions in the middle, and also be able to take more and more of the infamous petrodollar as well. And so if you're not familiar, we've covered this many times on Bitcoin Hard Talk over the years, but the petrodollar is a deal whereby whenever oil trades happen, they are made in dollars. That creates a demand for dollars, which allows the Ponzi scheme to continue and creates the demand for bonds, because people don't want to hold cash. Rather than put it at a bank where it can just be imploded, you have to lend it directly to the government. This allows it to roll over the bond scheme. But now, rather than 100% of all oil trades happening, from Saudi Arabia in dollars, about 30% are now happening in the Russian currency, and also the Chinese yuan, the Chinese currency as well. As the BRICS currency comes out, you would look to see a slow movement because, of course, Saudi Arabia is playing both sides of the equation right now. It is playing and looking to become and support becoming a member of BRICS, but at the same time, it needs the US military industrial complex in order to give its security contracts. And so America gets to sell all those weapons. Saudi Arabia gets its security guarantee. The dollar is used as this part of this petrodollar. America then gets to confiscate more assets from Americans by rolling over the Ponzi scheme, put those assets on the Federal Reserve, and that is the status quo as long as people can borrow from the Bank of Japan at 0%, so they can buy the stocks on the American stock market. And you have really, Saudi Arabia is like the central bank of oil, let's call it, because America, while it is the largest producer of oil, it needs to feed 350 million people, while Saudi Arabia only needs to feed 35 million people. So it has massive reserves and can decide when to create inflation for the world and when to transition in that multipolar world from just the dollar and get that balance right that can create the right type of balance. But remember, Saudi Arabia said, in order to normalize, Palestine has to be free. And then Iran said, in order for us to normalize, China needs to negotiate peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that requires the Palestine to be free. And the only country in the world that will not give Palestine freedom is Israel, because it bought US Congress. And every time you go to the United Nations meeting, 145 countries say we need to have a free Palestine state, and US veto votes it from the Security Council for Israel because it gets that money that it sends back to the Israeli lobby, which is why we are in this mess. And everybody's discovering, it seems that October the 7th was very beneficial to Israel in this situation, so that it can continue its Greater Israel project and take the West Bank, which certain lobbyists paid Trump 100 million, saying, I'll give you 100 million in campaign financing, but you need to annex Gaza. And he said, okay, I'll do that for you. But the problem is you need to ethnically cleanse and genocide quickly. And so you need to speed it up. This is taking too long. Too many people are discovering it. And it's becoming a big problem when Americans are discovering that US politics is occupied by Israel. Anyway, so we got stocks at new all-time high as a result of this, and we're this slow movement. Now, what is happening on the multipolar side? Now, remember, the key to retrieving peace is those geopolitical negotiations. We'll cover more on that on the geopolitical side. But on the financial side, we need to slowly transition and give countries freedom from the central banks that have the debt-based Ponzi schemes that causes all the issues. And so that requires the Bitcoin strategic reserve for every country, as El Salvador is showing people, so that eventually they have a choice of doing a peaceful transition, and therefore we don't need to fund the military industrial complex in order to get excessive debt through central banking. So in order to achieve that, we need to remove the US dollar as being the sole absolute power, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. But of course, we want all our countries to trade with each other, because that is how we had a very prosperous economy. So everybody retreating means that, you know, China will normalize with Taiwan because it needs its chips. And so if it needs its chips, that creates $2.2 trillion of economic destruction. And then that affects China, that affects Iran, that affects Russia, that affects America, that affects Europe, and we all risk World War III. And so we want to avoid that. And the best way to do that is have competition. We need a competition in currency by governments, which is Bitcoin. And we also need a multipolar currency. So competition to the dollar is all of the countries that have been sanctioned, pillaged, and overthrown by covert US operations, the military industrial complex and the deep state. They all come together and they wrap their currency around resources. And we now have 106 currencies that are looking to join BRICS, and there'll be an announcement at the BRICS summit in October. The latest member to formally join and make that application for a formal joining is Azerbaijan as well, which is important in the nuclear side and the oil side and the oil and gas side as well of the different corridors that are being formed in this multipolar world. By the way, we are working on a video series that makes it really, really clear for everybody to understand all these different strategic things and how you can protect yourself using Bitcoin in a Bitcoin artificial intelligence and central bank digital currency world. To be on the priority notification for that, we are making about 4 videos. I do it every 4 years, and I also invest live and show you how that investment performed. So you can see, because people often say to me, Simon, yeah, you were involved in Bitcoin right from the beginning. You got lucky. Well, I say, no, I'll start again and show you that this is repeatable and you can do the same. And so I do that every 4 years. And then I analyze the performance of if I started again and you did the same, what happened? And there was a 10x increase on the portfolio. If you would like to understand exactly how I do it, I want to support as many people in understanding how to do it, then head over to simondixon.com, grab yourself a free membership to the BitcoinHardTalk membership portal. I'll give you a free digital copy of my book. I'll give you the video series where I last did this 4 years ago. And I'll make sure that you're in the membership portal in case YouTube takes down our videos or X takes away our freedom of speech at any time in the future. And so you can have that login, and then you'll get a priority notification around that completely free video series that we'll be doing. Okay. Now, there was the conference will be happening, the BRICS Summit. There are now approximately 50 countries that are ready to accept the payment method. And this is an alternative to SWIFT. And they said it's going to be done on a blockchain. They call it a cryptocurrency. We don't have the technical details, whether that will be a private blockchain, whether that will be Ethereum, whether that will be something else, whether it be even something built on top of Bitcoin through the Taproot and different innovation that happened in recent upgrades to the Bitcoin network. We shall see. But it will be a direct competitor to SWIFT, which means that we can have more, as these currencies, whether the dollar gets oppressive, whether BRICS get oppressive, and we can have Bitcoin that essentially regulates the currencies because it produces a natural free market exit to the system so that we can live in peace. And that's what Bitcoin essentially is, a peaceful transition resistance movement away from the proof of weapons network, which is funded by war and destruction and corruption issued by central banks. Okay, so Russia announced that it is going to be launching 2 crypto exchanges. I'm assuming these are going to be national exchanges. So you're giving all your data to Russia, essentially. But they're also going to have two stable coins. And these two stable coins are going to be linked to the Chinese yuan, which means that you'll be able to send a Chinese yuan around the world as easy as sending an email, but also to the BRICS cryptocurrency, which they've said is going to be backed by gold and resources, which is why I think gold is reaching new all-time highs, because I think they're building those strategic asset reserves. And we shall see what happens with the Bitcoin side as well. So that report came out. So this is why it's really important to protect America from the Federal Reserve, so that we can make sure we don't have the destructive path that America is going down by following the path that the Federal Reserve has set itself, where you have $100 trillion, or sorry, $1 trillion, 100 trillion, $1 trillion of debt being added to America's balance sheet every 100 years, and having to borrow that from the Fed and pay the dividend of the Fed to the Fed's shareholders. So this is why it's good news that RFK is hopefully joining up with Trump, and let's hold him to account to put the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset in place. Good for America, good for hegemony around the world. But also, if they really want to drain the swamp, as a reminder, I said it at the beginning, then they must release the unredacted files of the 9/11 inquiry, the JFK files, and the Epstein files, so America can understand the truth and realize why it is such a disgusting act where America is being asked to fight war with Iran based upon false flag operations that makes us think that you need to protect yourself while exploding a PSYOP operation to manipulate inflation by allowing a flood of illegal immigrants, which is another industry, because they put them in those privatized camps there that are able to charge the US government for holding them. And then that leads to another debt and another wealth redistribution when you look at the flow, which is why that happens. But remember, I guarantee you it won't happen, because they are now part of the deep state, which is why both Harris, Biden, and Trump and RFK will increase the amount that they send from Israel this year from 3 billion to 20 billion already. And they'll look to put together more and more and more, so that Israel can have its AI-based military industrial complex and start looking and following the money in order to understand all these different flows. I want America to be free again, and I'd like it to be a peaceful transition as well. And as I said, the reason that they won't allow those two, but you can start to do your own research, because now, thanks to X Spaces, a massive amount of research, and you can look at the Google Trends. The Google Trends are showing that the Google search for dancing Israelis, Larry Silverstein, and various other things are going through the roof. And this is a big problem in trying to scam you into thinking the world needs to go to war with Iran right now. Okay. One thing I am really scared about, though, right now is that if they have exercised enough of their covert operations, enough people are broke and screwed by the system, living month to month, that suddenly Harris's version of the events and the economic policies will get very, very popular, because the more people you can get broke, the more they depend upon the government, and the more they beg the government to create more inflation, because they think if you give something to me now, it creates more inflation, but they don't know the difference. And so Harris may win. It is a very close race at the moment. The whole world will be impacted by the result of this, because the reality is we know what will happen if Harris wins. Trump will say that the election is rigged. And there are many, many people that think it is rigged, and the deep state is involved in that. And so therefore, that will cause a lot of problems across America. So Trump essentially has that hijacking, because we shall see what eventually happens. To be clear, if I were American, I am no fan of Trump. I am no fan of his policies, but because every single politician is working for the deep state and supporting the Israeli lobby in owning their politicians, that's all the same. So they will continue to fund that. That's our resistance movement. And that's the Bitcoin resistance movement to defund the central bank so that people can take back control. However, the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset is a strategy that I believe all governments need. And so therefore, Trump and RFK executing that and a deregulation, it won't create a smaller government, I can promise you that, but it will create more resources for America to be energy independent, and that supports a peaceful transition. And so therefore, if I were American, I would be voting Trump. But, this is just based upon my narrow understanding that fix the money, fix the world, and then we can defund all of the swamp, even though they are part of the swamp as well. And so we actually had announcements that the California State Senate Committee has approved a bill that will allow illegal immigrants to buy homes with $0 down payments and 0% interest loans. That is the latest initiative to roll over the Ponzi scheme, and how you know that it's completely disingenuous when they say that we're not actually weaponizing illegal immigration in order to fuel the Federal Reserve, because that will cause the same issue that it caused in 2008, where you had these subprime loans and then you increase the rates when inflation gets control. They all go bankrupt. It crashes the real estate market. That crashes the financial system, creates a credit squeeze. And guess what? All of the assets end up on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and they roll over the Ponzi scheme again. That is that exact type of policy. So you're not going to get politicians that do anything different there. Okay, so we had some announcement on the Harris policies as well. We got that there will be a tax on unrealized gains, so a wealth tax. What this means is that anybody that holds assets, like if I were American and I had my company like Bank to the Future, I may have an asset that is maybe worth like over $1 billion, but I can't sell those shares because it's a private company. It's not publicly traded. But I'd have to disclose those assets as I would all the Bitcoin if I was American. And then I'd need to sell my Bitcoin in order to pay the tax. And I'd need to probably borrow against my Bitcoin because I can't sell my private shares. And so I get more and deeper into debt in order to pay the tax on the unrealized illiquid shares. And if you can sell those shares, then it crashes the stock market a little bit further. But guess what? The rich elites will borrow from the Federal Reserve at 0% in order to pay the tax on that. And that creates more wealth inequality and more inflation. So all of these ridiculous central planning policies, none of them are going to work. They're absolutely ridiculous. But it makes you think that this tax on the wealthy is actually going to do something. And because everyone's deep in debt, because they don't have hard money, it makes them think, yeah, I'll have some of that. Sign me up, because I've been shafted by the Federal Reserve, but I think it is the evil Republicans, or I think it is the evil Democrats. So every 4 years we'll change it when we get more of the same and the same stuff. Fix the money, fix the world. Don't drain the swamp with symptoms. Drain the swamp by exposing the system for what it is and transitioning peacefully. So they have an increase in corporation tax as well. That will either encourage more people to leave America, as they always threaten, or create a new exotic scheme in order to, which is why very few of those companies pay that tax anyway under the current system, because they build jurisdiction in other countries, so it doesn't really work. Now, one thing I want you to understand that is really, really important in selecting the next US president, because it impacts us all. The next US president is going to have to negotiate with Saudi Arabia to try and keep as much of US dollar denominated oil and the petro-dollar in a time when the BRICS currency becomes a competitor. It's already gone down from 100% to 70% under the Biden administration as a result of Saudi Arabia siding with Russia instead of siding with America because Saudi Arabia is trying to say, what is the final negotiation here? And it's sitting right in the middle of that. Now, can you imagine Kamala Harris sitting down and negotiating the petrodollar? Or could you imagine Trump doing it? Whether you hate them, whether you love them, just think about that question. Also, they will be the person that has to sit down with Putin and negotiate what Ukraine is going to look like after the NATO expansion that led to excessive deaths in Ukraine and excessive deaths. Now that it has expanded Ukraine into Russia using UK weapons and American weapons funded by the military industrial complex, funded by the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. They're going to have to negotiate those deals. These are the important things, not the things that you're really focusing on, because this is what's going to decide the future of that. So now let's dive in. I'll take a quick water break in the geopolitical section, which will be the final section for this week's Bitcoin Hard Talk. Remember, the headline story is that right now there is rumors that RFK is going to be joining Trump. And if RFK does join Trump, hold him accountable to his Bitcoin 2024 policies, where he explained how Bitcoin can help America, national security, energy play, Bitcoin strategic reserve assets, and also an inflation play and a debt play. So RFK understands it, and an anti-war play as well, and releasing for the Bitcoin community the 9/11 unredacted files, freeing Ross, freeing the victims of that went to prison, in freeing Assange, freeing Snowden, because they just simply revealed the truth, and they were funded through Bitcoin because we have a geopolitically neutral currency that allows us to send to legal things that expose governments and keep them more honest. Okay. Right, I'm going to take a quick sip of water. We'll jump into the geopolitical section. Do me a favor, retweet, post, like, share, get me some traffic. We need more and more people prepared for what comes next. I'm going to take a quick water break. After 3, do that for me. Thank you very much. Okay, on the geopolitical stuff, we had an announcement from Germany. Germany is broke because it gave away its currency to the occupation from the European Central Bank. And while the European Central Bank is essentially big Germany, it is also an occupying force around all the countries in Europe that gave away their currency. The Bank of England didn't do it. And ironically, everybody Brexited, even though they got all the free trade agreements, but they got to keep the Bank of England, which is another occupation by England. But being able to control the Bank of England is better than the European Central Bank. But England decided to exit that anyway. And so then it ended up with all sorts of different immigrants rather than European immigrants, and psyops that create the civil war within England that leads to justifying the fact that they want you to support the war with Iran, which is a psyop from Israel, as we know. But anyway, Germany has decided that it is now suspending additional payments to Ukraine, and so it's not getting additional military support from Ukraine. And this is why we had the expansion of Ukraine using UK and American weapons into Russia, so that it can say, hey, guess what? We made progress. We killed some Russian people, and more Ukrainian people and civilians are dying. But now, America, you better give us more and more money and create more inflation for your people, because we are progressing here. And at the same time, Ukrainian forces advance deeper into Russia, which is a massive, massive escalation of the NATO expansion at the expense of more and more civilians as well. And Italy's deputy prime minister, he came out and said that NATO is providing Ukraine with the weapons to strike against targets in Russia, and that has been escalating to today. And the deputy prime minister of Italy believes that this action will lead to a global war, which is obviously the agenda of the central banks anyway. Now, Russia TV obviously it's just as propagandized as Fox News and CNN and all of the American TV, giving you one side of the story. But Russia TV came out and reported that Ukraine wants to use a nuclear dirty bomb within Russia. Believe it if you want. Maybe that's just fear and propaganda from that side, but it's the same fear and propaganda that NATO and the Israeli lobby are using through their media network controls and APEC in order to make you think you need to go to war with Iran as well. What else happened? Well, remember last week we covered that Germany, they arrested some Ukrainians for doing the Nord Stream terrorist attack, where it blew up the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany that sent Germany into an inflationary cycle. And then America came along, and it was America PSYOP. We know that. It was a covert operation from America using Ukraine, their NATO base, in order to try and create issues for Russia at the same time as they were sanctioning. And instead, it led to inflation within Germany. So they tried to topple the German economy so that America could then sell its natural gas to Germany instead. But Germany is still avoiding those sanctions that it inflicts upon everyone else, with the exception of the German government. That was a terrorist attack. Russia came out and basically said, we had those arrests right after that as well. What did it say? It said Ukrainians would not have been able to carry out the attack on Nord Stream pipeline without the United States assistance. So it's basically calling out that this was a US covert operation. And so right now within Ukraine and Russia, America is in a direct war rather than just a proxy war with Russia, and it's escalating further. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who is probably the real president of America right now, President Benjamin Netanyahu and Antony Blinken are the real president while Biden's sleeping. But what did he tell everyone that he needs? He announced to the world that Iran could declare itself a nuclear power by the end of the year. So therefore, we need to go and suspend those weapons of mass destruction, because Netanyahu said in Congress that we need to do that. This is the exact power play that happened in Iraq. And we know that you need a false flag operation within America in order to justify that. So please watch what you are being fed. And I think Americans are wiser. And I don't think they want to go to war for Israel, but there are 40,000 troops in the Middle East right now waiting for Iran's escalation as Israel hijacked and launched an attack within Iranian borders. And so they still are meant to be retaliating. I was expecting something to happen sooner but we are still waiting. And I still believe that something is to be expected. And at the same time, they're playing this game of pretending that Netanyahu wants to release the hostages and negotiate peace, when already he's said, we will not end the war. And so is just basically saying, return the hostages and we'll continue to blow you up and we'll continue to rape your prisoners as they are being trialed for. And our politicians will continue to defend the right to do that, because they believe that Palestinians are some humans with the 10,000 hostages that they have right now. And so there is no ceasefire, but we're getting the same thing where Blinken's coming out saying, hey, guess what? Israel's accepted it, but the opposition hasn't. And we know that instead what they're doing is Israel has now decided to take the war to Lebanon and expand it for the Greater Israel Project. And so, Israel has already voted in parliament that there'll never be a Palestinian state, and they will not end the war until they expand the territory completely. And so China decided that it needed to call that out. So President Xi Jinping said that Palestine needs to be recognized as an independent state to resolve the conflict in the Middle East. America need to retreat its borders, which is stopping, its military bases, which is stopping that happen. and it wants to normalize between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But that will support the BRICS currency, which will support a decrease in the petro-dollar, which will end the occupation of the Federal Reserve, because America will need to have a strategic Bitcoin reserve asset instead of going to war and funding the whole thing by the Federal Reserve. And so recognize the psyop that's happening here. China tried to reiterate to the world. Now, do I believe China? No, but I do know its track record. It built the Great Wall of China to keep the barbarians out rather than expanding. And it does have a good track record of, yeah, I don't like the way China operates, and I did spend a lot of time there. But it's adjusted to capitalism, and China's looking more like America every day, and America's looking more like China every day because it's occupied by the Fed. But they came out and said, look, China, we are not the US, nor do we want to become like the US. China does not pursue hegemony. They want to trade with America, and they don't want to practice power politics and destabilize regions, which is their track record so far. They've deployed over $1 trillion through Belt and Road Initiative loans, and they don't come with regime change. They come with new corridors that are being built in order to be able to trade with each other. And that's the record, put it straight. But we're told, that this is the communist country. And, I don't like its economic model, but it is a different economic model. I don't like the freedom of speech, but remember, the bans are because they want to keep the data within China so it can't be weaponized and sent to Israel through backdoors that Snowden revealed in his NSA report through the Snowden revelations, because he knows that gets used in order to weaponize. But China wants to do business with Israel, with Palestine, with Saudi Arabia, with America, with Iran, and it has the capacity to put those negotiations together. And that's why it's important to allow the dollar to compete in the market without regime changes. And so it says China has the best record of peace and security amongst all of the major countries. I agree with that. It's China's propaganda. You decide what's right. There's lots of things that I think the Chinese people should hold their government to account for, just as the Iranian people should hold their regime and government to account for, just as the American people should hold their government to account for, just as the UK government should do as well. But we shouldn't implement regime change that destabilize the region and lead to assets being stolen, just like is the plan with Iran right now, because, of course, they don't care about the oil or the gas. They care about democracy, of course. They don't want people to have nuclear weapons, because when you have a nuclear weapon, it just means that you have to negotiate with them and do diplomacy. And so what we had is an announcement from China, from Russia, and from Iran that now Iran's oil exports have hit a 6-year high, boosted by sales to China. And now, even though Russia, because it's essentially a war economy at the moment, it is even needed to import some additional oil, which is supporting the Iran economy, which is why both China and Russia say that they need Iran to survive in order to maintain peace. And so it all comes back to freeing Palestine, making sure the genocide doesn't happen. And there's only one country in the way for that. And there's only one country that enables it, which is America. It's pretty simple. The world can have world peace. And that is such an outrageous statement. But now when you follow the money, we understand how the world works. And we will keep you updated every week on Bitcoin Hard Talk to make sure that you're protecting yourself, whatever the governments and whatever the occupation from these central banks do. And so China and Russia have said that they will continue to expand and strengthen military relations with Iran. So Iran is becoming a nuclear power to defend itself from Israel. And it may have only one choice if America decides to still fund Israel, and that is just to declare itself as a nuclear force, which takes away the deal that was negotiated between between Iran and America before that has now been torn up by Trump and has now been destabilized by giving so much money to Israel. And that led to the end of the Abraham Accords, which is a way of sidestepping Iran, which is a way of allowing a genocide to happen within Palestine without anyone knowing about it, which is what led to October the 7th. And Israel wanted that to happen because we've seen the track record of covert operations. If JFK and Trump will drain the swamp and release those files that will release the names that will make America absolutely appalled, so they can understand that many Americans have died over time in order to create that fake war and terror that is scamming the Jewish people to make them think that they need to go to Israel, even though it's the least safe place to be, so that they can get them to register with the IDF and fight for what they are being told is the defense of the Jewish people in a fake war of terror against the Muslim people, and trying to co-opt the Christian faith in order for us to go to World War III. I think it's pretty simple, and I think China can negotiate that. And I think America, if it does its Bitcoin strategic asset reserve, can go for a more cooperative relationship and allow that to happen. But we are seeing absolute atrocities happening, continuing to happen, more and more massacres, and those massacres are now heading over to Lebanon to fight a much, much stronger militarized force in Hezbollah and expand the war further. So we saw a massive increase in the number of strikes between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel, and that is just going to escalation. So my final thought on what is it and why does this happen, I think I've covered from the Bitcoin's perspective why RFK and Trump joining hands is a big thing. I think I've explained why if I were American, I would vote for Trump. And then I think I've also explained what I would hold them account to in order to drain the swamp, which they won't do because they've already accepted the checks from Israel that says they need to annex Gaza and commit a very fast genocide rather than the slow one through starvation and slow massacres that is happening right now. That's what you need to keep an eye out for. And then there needs to be somebody that can negotiate that the draining of the NATO swamp and not allowing NATO to expand into the Greater Israel project and to surround China that will cause them to reunify. And so we can have Taiwan sending all the AI chips, the Bitcoin mining chips, and all the chips that every single of the top companies in America that are being pumped by the Fed need. And then China and America can build their independent chip industry in order to stop making this such a geopolitical force in order to destabilize the region. So I think I've explained why I think that is a good thing that RFK and Trump, but, you know, as I said, don't believe a word that they say, but America needs to protect itself from the Fed. And so I've explained all those different things. We need a multipolar world. We need absolute power to not absolute to not corrupt absolutely. And all eyes are on what will happen with RFK because he knows the policy. The Bitcoin community gave it to him. And please free Assange and allow him to go to America so he can expose America for all the war crimes. And we can continue funding it through Bitcoin, and people can have self-custody so they don't need to worry about their bank account shutting them down because they want to support the truth, which can support American democracy for real, so that we can have a shot at ending the occupation by the Federal Reserve at the right time. And so that Saudi can decide that it can normalize with Iran and it can do business and split the petro-dollar between the BRICS corridor and the US dollar. And we can have Bitcoin regulate the whole system, because when governments get too oppressive, governments can exit, companies can exit, and individuals can exit. As we transition to this world of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies, every single country, you need to protect yourself from the occupation of the Ponzi schemes, the usury riba-based money, that is completely forbidden in constitutions, the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran. And we need to get back to the sustainable financial systems. And you need to exit and do a peaceful resistance from this. And as always, on simondixon.com, I will make sure that you are fully up to date so that we can do this together. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Many are going to get hurt. Others are going to do well. And I want you to be one of those on the right side of the change, because I want a lot of people educated and understanding that there is a peaceful path, and we just need to end the occupation by central banks globally and get those the deep state out of politics, buying our politicians in order to pump those covert industries that are causing so many problems and driving us into World War III, so we can do it with peace, love, and unity. I will see you next week in Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 52. I'm going to be doing an interview, which I think is very important, and the normal this week in Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics. Peace.